Lists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Mikhail Gorbachev was a man who changed the face of this world and indeed the prospects for peace at the end of the 20th century. His promise was to bring about a freer, more democratic Russia and the end of the Soviet Union. How long did that promise last? Of course, we've seen the real turmoil that Russia has poured into and the gradual creep of authoritarianism return to that country. Today, we explore the legacy of Mikhail Gorbachev. That, and a bit of energy bills too, all after the headlines.
A very good morning. It's 9:31. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date on GB News. The last leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, has died at the age of 91. He's widely praised for his role in bringing an end to the Cold War. His death has inspired an outpouring of tributes from world leaders, including Boris Johnson, who says he's admired Gorbachev's courage and integrity.
Mikhail Gorbachev is one of those people who triggered a series of changes that perhaps he didn't anticipate. Maybe he paid his own political price for it. But when history is written, he will be, I think, one of the authors of fantastic change for the better in the world. And what I worry about today is that the current leadership in Moscow is intent on undoing the good that Mikhail Gorbachev did.
New figures show that food is rising at its fastest rate since the financial crisis in 2008. The British Retail Consortium say the annual increase in fresh food prices jumped to 10.5%. That's up from 8% in July, and it's products like milk and margarine that are going up the highest. They say the war in Ukraine is continuing to put pressure on food prices. Royal Mail workers are striking again today in an ongoing dispute over pay, with further industrial action planned. The Communication Workers Union says more than 100,000 members are involved, making it the biggest strike of the summer. The action follows a walkout last week in a protest and a 2% pay rise, although the company says more money is on offer. Further strikes are planned for Thursday the 8th and Friday the 9th of September. A team of inspectors from the UN's nuclear watchdog are leaving Ukraine's capital, and they're travelling to the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia power plant. The International Atomic Energy Agency are going to inspect the plant for damage after weeks of shelling nearby raised fears of a radiation accident. The agency inspecting said it was a complex operation.
You know, these operations are very complex operations. We are going to a war zone. We are going to occupy territory, and this requires the explicit guarantees from not only from the Russian Federation, also from the Republic of Ukraine, and we have been able to secure that.
TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now let's go back to the briefing with Tom.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:34 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, the last leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, died last night following a long illness, aged 91. Acclaimed for bringing the Cold War to a peaceful end, he's been hailed as a figure who changed the course of history through his policies of openness with the West and reforms within the USSR. Famously, Margaret Thatcher said he was a man with whom she could do business. And the genuine connection between Gorbachev, Thatcher and Ronald Reagan cannot be overstated in ending the evils of communism within the USSR and the threat of a third world war between superpowers. Yet, it has to be noted that despite the promise that Gorbachev laid out of a free, democratic Russia, that promise has gradually slipped away under the increasingly authoritarian dictatorship of Vladimir Putin. Well, reflecting on the legacy of Mikhail Gorbachev earlier this morning, Prime Minister Boris Johnson had this to say.
Mikhail Gorbachev, yes, well, Mikhail Gorbachev is one of those people who changed the world and unquestionably changed it for the better. When you look at what he did to make Europe whole, free, to give freedom to the countries of the former Soviet Union, it was a quite extraordinary thing. And of course, Mikhail Gorbachev is one of those people who triggered a series of changes that perhaps he didn't anticipate. Maybe he paid his own political price for it. But when history is written, he will be, I think, one of the authors of a fantastic change for the better in the world. And what I worry about today is that the current leadership in Moscow is intent on undoing the good that Mikhail Gorbachev did, and is intent on a revanchist attempt, a revenge-driven attempt to recreate that Soviet empire. And you're seeing that in Ukraine today, and that's the tragedy. It's something that I think Mikhail Gorbachev would have thought was absolutely unthinkable and unwarranted and irrational.
Better, don't they?
Well, I think the police do an amazing job, and I've just been out with a team here in South London watching what they do. Look at neighbourhood crime, which is the thing that really affects the quality of life of most people in this country, and it's down by about 38% on 2019 since this government came in. I think that's great effort by the police, not just by the Metropolitan Police, by police up and down the country. And what you're seeing is 13,700 odd more police now on the streets. That helps. That makes a difference. But what also makes, come to your point about follow through, what also makes a difference is giving the police the powers they need to give criminals the tough sentences that they deserve. And that's what we put through in our legislation. I'm pleased to see it having an effect, but I'm also pleased to see the activism and the energy of the police here in London. Yes, of course, we've got to make our society ever safer, but you look at what they've done, 38% reduction in neighbourhood crime. I think it's a massive achievement. Well, I've just seen them. I tell you what, I've just seen a bunch of police officers who woke quite a lot of drug dealers this morning, and they woke them long before they were expecting to have their breakfast. They woke them with warrants, and they woke them with the news that they were under arrest for causing misery in the communities of London. And that's what I want the police to do. That's what Pretty wants them to do. I thank them for what they're doing. They do an absolutely fantastic job.
Do you reckon? Last couple of days of your premiership, is Britain broken?
Absolutely not. This country is got an incredible future and has everything going for it. This is the look at the place that people want to invest in, which is the country that attracts more venture capital investment now than China. It's the United Kingdom. Which country has I think more billion-pound startup tech companies than France, than Germany, than Israel put together? It is the United Kingdom. Why do people want to come here? Because it is the place to be. So what we're doing now, and what I'm proud that we've done over the last 3 years or so, is put in a lot of things that will make this country fit for the future. Yes, it is absolutely true that because of Putin's war in Ukraine, we have pressures on the cost of living, but we have the financial strength to get through them. And what we are also doing is making sure that we have the long-term British energy supplies that we need to get our people through it. So just look at you, and you talk about people coming to this country. Actually, that is just a symptom of why this country is one of the most successful on earth. Of course people want to come and live here. Of course it's a perennial difficulty to stop people coming here illegally, but we're taking powers to do that, and I'm pleased we're doing it.
Just very finally, just very finally, I know a lot of people are going to write things about you in the coming days, coming weeks. How would you like to be remembered? What do you think your legacy is?
I think as the Prime Minister who in 3 years helped to bring neighbourhood crime down by 38%, thanks to the work of the Metropolitan Police and others. Thank you very much. Thank you,
Prime Minister.
The Prime Minister there talking, of course, about Mikhail Gorbachev, but also a little bit about his own legacy. Well, let's explore the Russia issue in more depth and indeed Gorbachev's legacy. I'm delighted to be joined now by Samantha de Benden, Associate Fellow at Chatham House. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I suppose this isn't a particular shock. Mikhail Gorbachev had been sort of out of the rigmarole of politics, sort of hadn't been commenting on things for a number of years due to his long illness. Yet the long shadow of what he decided back in the late 1980s and early 1990s really has shaped much of what Russia became.
Yes, it has. What's really interesting is that Gorbachev is still actually hated in Russia. Even liberal Muscovites really despised him, they hated him, and for a number of different reasons. So we in the West see him as the architect of the end of the Soviet Union and at the end of the Cold War. It's important to remember that before Gorbachev decided to let the Soviet Union go, he did actually initiate a number of attempts to keep the Union together by violence. He sent tanks into Vilnius, in the capital of Lithuania, before it became independent. He sent tanks into Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, in what's called the Black January of 1991, where he tried to put down some uprisings that were also hoping for Azerbaijani independence. But contrary to Putin, Gorbachev realized at some point that the Soviet Union was going to collapse and that keeping it together by force and by violence was not the solution. So he came to the peaceful resolution towards the end when he realized how desperate the bloodshed would be. And he hasn't really said a lot publicly about the war in Ukraine, but he has confided to some of his friends. There's a very famous Russian journalist called Benediktov, to whom Gorbachev confided very shortly after the invasion of Ukraine and said that he thinks it's a mistake and that this could potentially be the end of Putin. Interestingly enough, for a man who's full of contradictions, he supported the Russian annexation of Crimea.
It's really fascinating there, that distinction, the full-scale assault on Ukraine clearly too far for him. It's interesting, though, his own political journey, that he was a committed communist. Of course, he did become the leader of the USSR, but there's some analysis to say that he sort of drifted in his opinions over time, moving from sort of his belief in communism to something more of a socially democratic future for Russia. To what extent do you subscribe to that theory?
I think it's going to take historians a long time to really figure out what Gorbachev really thought. Did he even know himself what he really wanted? When he embarked on reforming the USSR, his goal was to make Bolshevism work. And he initiated some reforms, he initiated economic reforms, which took on a life of their own. And his goal was actually to make the Soviet economy work, to make the USSR and communism work. And when it didn't work, he changed his mind. He was, they say only clever people change their mind and only idiots never change their mind. And so he did change his mind. He did adapt. He was flexible. Gorbachev was the first general secretary of the Soviet Communist Party who actually had a proper formal education. He was one of the first sort of what some Russians like to call normal leaders, i.e. he was not someone who'd come up through, he did come up through poverty, but he managed to get an education. And this informed many of his decisions and his adaptability. But he did not set out to get rid of communism. He set out to make communism work. And when it didn't, then there was an adaptation. But I don't think he really wanted to see capitalism in the way certainly not in the way it ended up developing in Russia, but even the Western-style capitalism was not his goal.
And yet he ended up famously appearing in an advert for Pizza Hut when that American business made its way into new and open Russia. Really, really fascinating man. Well, Samantha de Benden, thank you so much for your analysis there this morning on The Briefing. Really appreciate it. Well, now I'm joined next by Nikolai Petrov, Senior Research Fellow on Russia and Eurasia, on the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House. Nikolai, thanks for joining us this morning. I suppose looking at the legacy of Gorbachev, more than what he was doing in his own time in power, it does seem to have rather unravelled. It does seem that that promise of a more democratic, more open Russia post the USSR has all fallen apart. What was the key turning point?
In my view, what we see now is telling us that Gorbachev's way, the one he did offer in mid-80s, how to transform the Soviet Union, this way has been severely criticized by Putin, for example. It was a right way, and the option we do see now is an attempt to play the Cold War end in a different way. So I think Gorbachev is a great man, a person who did contribute a lot to the development of democracy, not only in the part of the world where he used to be the Secretary General, but in the whole world. And the fact that history did go in an opposite way means only that there is another oscillation of the pendulum. But I think it tells that Gorbachev was right and his contribution was great.
Looking at how he interacted with leaders in the West, particularly that famous meeting in 1984, before he became president of the USSR, or in charge of the USSR, I should say, meeting Margaret Thatcher for the first time, coming to London, and that relationship beginning on quite even terms. Margaret Thatcher saying, "This is a man with whom I can do business." How important was that relationship specifically and what unfurled over the next decade?
I think it was extremely important, and Gorbachev did, when coming to power, and even a little earlier when coming to Britain, for example, he did demonstrate human face of the USSR, the one which was so unique. And in his case, it wasn't just like Putin's way to charm the leaders. It was very sincere, and he was pretty much sincere person, and the personal contribution he made, the personal chemistry was extremely important, because that time the USSR under Gorbachev got very essential support from Western leaders.
Yes, and that personal connection, potentially with Margaret Thatcher, acting as that bridge between the USA and the USSR, the relationship that Mikhail Gorbachev later developed with Ronald Reagan, visiting his ranch. This specific sense of personal relationships between these three titans of world affairs really did bring about the end of the Cold War.
Yes, and it's important to understand that although Putin can and could make a very positive impression when meeting with Western leaders, this was not followed by any positive actions, unlike in case of Gorbachev. So not only he impressed Western leaders by his sincerity, by his openness, by his eagerness to change the country, but he did not prevent the country from changing, whether intentionally or not.
What is the difference then with Vladimir Putin, who was initially thought to be a Western-facing leader when he became president of the Russian Federation. He came to London as his first international trip. He met with Tony Blair. They shook hands. There was talk even of potentially Russia joining in some form the European Union, or at least an associate agreement. There was all of this hope of Western-facing Russia, of liberalising Russia. What happened in the mind of Vladimir Putin to turn it all so far from that?
I don't think that Vladimir Putin did change essentially his mind, except for the fact that what he did offer the West was a division of the world, which would give Russia free hand in controlling political development in post-Soviet world. And he didn't get it. But I don't think, and when not getting it, he hated the West. He did decide that Western leaders, were wrong and are hypocritical. And he did show his real face. But what we see now, I think it's movement in the opposite direction. And after Gorbachev, it did, oscillate at the time of Boris Yeltsin. But when Putin came to power, step by step, the country moved in direction of Stalin rather than the future.
Really, really sad turn of affairs. Well, Nikolai Petrov, thank you so much for setting out your view there, of course, Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House. Well, related to this subject, of course, is the subject of energy and Russia today. Yesterday, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz insisted that the country was well prepared to tackle any possible energy shortages as Russia's war in Ukraine continues to pinch European gas supplies. Fears continue to grow about the rising prices that will hit consumers across this continent this winter. And that fear will only intensify when temperatures begin to drop. But could this have been avoided? Back in September 2018, during a speech at the UN General Assembly, sense came from the mouth of someone who most would perhaps not expect sense to come. Well, it was met by laughter from German delegates. Let's listen to who exactly was prescient in this area.
Reliance on a single foreign supplier can leave a nation vulnerable to extortion and intimidation. That is why we congratulate European states such as Poland for leading the construction of a Baltic pipeline so that nations are not dependent on Russia to meet their energy needs. Germany will become totally dependent on Russian energy if it does not immediately change course. Here in the Western Hemisphere, we are committed to maintaining our independence from the encroachment of expansionist foreign powers.
Well, there you could hear Donald Trump, the former president of the United States, saying that Germany will become too dependent on Russia, that could lead to energy shortages, and indeed the German delegation smirking, smiling and laughing in response. The media in the United States of America picked up on this at the time. A headline from the Washington Post back in 2018 said, Trump accused Germany of becoming totally dependent on Russian energy at the UN. The Germans just smirked. Well, at the time, that was seen as a pro-German comment, an anti-Trump comment. Now it could well be seen as precisely the opposite. I'm pleased now to be joined by Sammy Wilson, the Member of Parliament for East Antrim and Vice Chair for the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Energy Security. And Sammy, it is remarkable, not only listening to those words in 2018 from a man who I don't think is particularly prescient on a number of issues, but on this he seemed to be bang on, but particularly looking at the way the media responded to this at the time, mocking Donald Trump for saying that Germany was becoming too dependent on Russia. Clearly, they've got egg on their faces now.
Well, of course, the Germans are not smiling anymore because of the disastrous changes which they made in their energy policy. First of all, they became more and more reliant on Russia for gas, and were quite nonchalant about that. In fact, I think that the Chancellor at that stage saw that as a positive step, bringing the two countries together and having greater trade relations. And of course, this was all linked to their policy on climate change and net zero, where they were wanting to move towards greener energy. And of course, we now see the situation where they've closed down most of their nuclear power stations, where they're relying on other countries which produce power from nuclear, and where they're now in a situation where they're being held hostage by Russia. And indeed, at the time when Donald Trump was giving the warnings, other people were pointing out that given the autocratic nature of Russia, what the Germans were really doing was giving a whip hand to a dictator who would abuse that. And I suspect that their energy policy, their short-sighted energy policy, has actually contributed to Putin's ability and willingness to invade the Ukraine. The Ukrainians are suffering as well as the German population because of the mistakes that were made.
Whenever I've had the privilege to interview a Ukrainian member of parliament on this show, they've always pointed to the billions of euros that particularly Western European countries are sending continually to the Kremlin, funding that war in Ukraine through Nord Stream 1. And thank goodness Nord Stream 2 never came on stream, even though the Germans were initially in favour of it. I wonder, what lessons should we take from the monumental failures here, particularly of Western European energy policy over the last 2 decades?
Well, I think that the lesson that we should learn in the United Kingdom is not to make the same mistakes as the Germans have made. And that's why I'm glad that Liz Truss is now saying that she's going to introduce policies which will make us less dependent upon outside producers of gas, for example, and oil, by giving new licenses for drilling in the North Sea, for looking at fracking. Don't forget, we've got 150 years supply of gas in our own country, in the north of England, as a natural resource which will be transforming to that part of the United Kingdom and also give us energy security. And I hope that we will learn from the lessons of the Germans and the lessons of Europe, that whether those autocratic regimes are in the Middle East or whether they're in Russia, that we should not become reliant on those regimes, especially when we've got resources of our own. And therefore, we have to have the kind of fiscal initiatives, policy initiatives, which will encourage energy self-sufficiency. That's what our all-party group in the House of Commons is looking at continually. How do we make ourselves less dependent upon other countries for what is necessary? Yes. Cheap energy is necessary to drive economic growth and to give people the standard of living which they expect.
Well, I'm really sorry to have to end the interview here because this is such an important conversation and one that we could continue for such a long time, but we have run to the end of the programme. I just want to note, though, NATO in the last decade pointed to potentially Russian funding of anti-fracking campaigners. What a policy. Well, that's it for the show today. Coming up, it's To The Point, which will explore all of these issues in greater depth as well. Catch me again tomorrow at 9:30, but for now, here's the weather.
Hello, I'm Aidan McGivern from the Met Office. It's the final day of meteorological summer and it's another fine day. Sunny spells, feeling warm in the sunshine. Still a few showers around, but high pressure is well and truly in charge of the weather for the rest of Wednesday, which is what we've seen an awful lot of this summer. High pressure sitting to the north of the UK. Still a keen breeze blowing on the southern flank of that high, so another blustery day to come around English Channel coast, for example, as well as the east coast of England. That will make it feel cool on that east coast, and there'll also be showers around the east coast of England into northern England and North Wales later. But away from those showers, actually, I think a bit more sunshine compared with the last couple of days, especially towards western and southern areas. And temperatures responding 25 or 26 Celsius in the south, 18 to 21 in the northern half of the UK. Into the evening, and many of the showers tend to fade away, but there'll still be one or two affecting coastal parts of eastern England, and clear spells extensively overnight, with the winds easing inland and, for some sheltered spots, a relatively cool night, temperatures dipping into the single figures. But where we see main urban areas and a bit more of a breeze, we're looking at 13 to 15 Celsius by dawn tomorrow. Plenty of sunshine then, first thing, with some mist and fog patches quickly burning away. And then a similar theme with some showers developing across the central swathe of the UK, from southern Scotland into Northern Ireland, Northern England and North Wales. But away from any isolated showers, effectively it's another fine day. Temperatures reaching 25 Celsius in the south, 20 to 22 in the north. So the first day of September starts off fine, but then it quickly changes. Friday sees more showers developing, especially in the northwest, and then showers or longer spells of rain and thunderstorms expected through the weekend.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled.